To begin your journal analysis, we're going to go through a handful of steps. This video is going to walk you through those steps. This information can also be found in the Canvas journal. So before you begin anything, you want to take a look at the required readings and resources provided for the module. Each module has a different theme, and so you want to make sure that you are following the theme. So the analysis journal looks at either artifacts or artworks. And there's a couple of ways to break that information down. So the first thing is an artifact typically is the thing that we think of, the object that collects the information that goes with the culture or history of a people, right? So typically these are things like physical objects that capture a cultural style or a cultural influence. They include things like weapons, pottery, materials like sacred objects, artwork. Those kinds of things all are considered artifacts, right? So in your readings and in the resources I provide, you're going to be able to find a whole slew of different artifacts that you can pick from, and those would be available for the analysis component of the journal. There's one more kind of artifact that really is just synonymous with artifact, but we kind of separate it out, and that's known as a mentifact. It's kind of a play on words with the artifact. And these are the ideas, philosophies, myths, stories, values, and other concepts that live in people's heads, but they're not necessarily in physical objects, right? So they might have a physical representation, like a symbol or an icon, but that symbol or icon wouldn't actually be the thing it represents the thing, right? A lot of our cultures that we study, if they're from like native groups, so like the Native Americans, those peoples of Africa, or the Australian Aborigines, these people were not literate people, and they were very mobile people. And although they have artifacts like arrowheads and pottery, but there are other things like their tales, their myths, their religions, their philosophies that aren't always captured in a physical object, but they were transmitted, right? They were shared through oral tradition, they were shared through legends and stories. And so those still count. Those still count as things that we can analyze, but we just have to kind of be more diligent in how we go about that, because there isn't always a thing that we can look at, okay? For our intents and purposes here in our class, artifacts and mentifacts are really, they're all the same stuff. So whenever I use the word artifact, that includes mentifacts. So feel free, if you want to look at like an oral tradition or a story or a tale, by all means, that's always fair game as well. Okay, now a kind of artifact, a specific type of artifact, is art itself, right? Like the kinds of artworks we produce. Not all artifacts are artworks, but all artworks are artifacts, if that makes sense. Okay, so it's sort of like rectangles and squares, right? All squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. Similar to artifacts and artwork, okay? We can break down artwork into three major kind of themes or major forms, okay? And so the forms are visual, literary, and performing. Now, the first group, the visual, these are what we always call just art. We typically just refer to like as if you're thinking of an art class. So these things include paintings and photography and printmaking and drawing, but also sculpture, architecture, and so on. They have a visual component, they have a physical component, and we often analyze them in terms of their physical space and their visual symbolism, right? So that's a big, broad term, the visual arts. Some folks will actually divide the visual arts into, painting and drawing, or like two-dimensional art, and then three-dimensional art like sculpture and handicrafts, and that might be distinct from architecture. Again, for our intents and purposes, we kind of blend all that into the arts. Okay, so that's the art that we're working with. The second form art can take in our class in the humanities is literary art. So this would include things like narratives, like novels and stories, poetry, theater, and film. Okay. Sometimes sacred traditions also fall under this category. So that'd be like things like a sacred text, like the I Ching or the Bhagavad Gita or the Bible or the Quran. It might also include sacred practices and sacred tenets that come out of like Buddhism. We can sometimes see these as a literary form because they are often written and they have plots and characters, and we can sometimes analyze it in that way, right? But the literary arts are beginnings in writing, right? So they're different than the visual arts, where you're meant to look at the visual arts and experience them in the visual content, not necessarily with the literary arts, right? Like you don't necessarily look at a book and try to analyze the white page with a black font. You can, text can be analyzed in that way, but typically what we're doing with the literary arts is we're looking at the themes, the characters, the plot, the setting, that kind of stuff. And the last group of arts is sort of a kind of catch-all for the arts that happen in time. So that's music, dance, and other kinds of performing art. Okay, so these are the kind of art that you're supposed to experience in the moment, and they would not have the same experience the second time you experience it. For instance, if you go to a musical performance or you hear a musical piece, especially if you hear it live, it may be performed subtly, but definitely differently than it was the first. This includes all forms of dance, all forms of music. There's some overlap between theater and performing arts, so there's definitely some overlap there. And then there's some overlap with performing arts and visual arts and things like animation, right? So there are time-based arts that also can exist in the visual and the literary form. But then there are time-based arts which are solely time, and that would be like music and dance and other performance pieces. Okay, so you choose an artifact or an artwork out of the required readings or the required multimedia resources I provide in the module, and then you choose to analyze that piece. Then you do it again. And this is where students oftentimes kind of lose it, or they don't realize we're supposed to do two. You do two because eventually what you do is you compare and contrast the two. So ideally, you choose two that are very uniquely connected. So if you're choosing an artwork, for instance, choosing two pieces by the same artist or two pieces from the same movement makes a lot of sense. If you're choosing artifacts, then it'd be things from the same culture or the same time period, right? And then the idea is to compare and contrast. Now, sometimes students want to be a little bit more creative and compare and contrast things in a very different way. So maybe they don't compare and contrast things that are similar but are intentionally opposite. And that's fine. The only qualifier is that you're touching on the themes of the module. So please double check that the works come out of the readings and come out of the multimedia that's provided. If it doesn't come out of that, you run the risk of it not being counted. And typically what will happen is once you submit your work, if it's not the right theme or not for the right module, I will write you a comment that says, this is great, thanks for doing this, but however, this missed the point of this module, and this missed the point of this theme, and you're gonna have to go back and redo it. This one won't count for credit. Sometimes I'll count them for extra credit or other things like that, but what you should know is it won't count for actual credit for that journal. Okay, so how do you do this? How's this process? Okay, so that pre-step, the very first thing is you're going to pick two artworks from the module, okay? Then you're going to go through a step-by-step analysis of that artwork. And the reason we do it in this very methodical way is because there's certainly an experience of art and artifacts and culture and history in a very like intuitive and kind of like following your gut. But what we're trying to do is really look at this from an objective standpoint or near objective, meaning not just your personal experience, but how do others experience the work as well? Okay, so we go through a two-part process, analysis and interpretation, right? And we basically analyze the piece, kind of answering some questions and doing some reflection. So that first part, analysis, asks questions like, what is it? What form does it take? What choices did the creator make? How do you know? And then when you're writing, you want to use descriptions and explanations to guide your work. And typically you're going to look at things like the elements of the arts, right? And you can use the elements of the arts for artifacts or artworks. You can use the elements of art to help understand the choices the creator made in order to bring this thing to life, right? So if it's a visual thing, you can look at the color, the texture, the shape, the lines. If it's a literary thing, you can look at the character, the setting, the plot. If it's a performing thing, then you can look at the roles and how time and space are used. And you can do that not just for, say, like a painting or a novel, but you can also do that for something that was handmade, like an arrowhead or a vase, right? You can look at the form it takes and what were the choices the creator made. Okay, and then you just kind of fill in right here. You fill in the answer to those questions. And that's how you know you're analyzing the piece in a scholarly and intellectual way. Okay. The second step is interpretation. This is by far the more complicated of the two. Because in this step, you're going to be asking questions like, what does it mean? And what is its purpose? What is being communicated? Consider your point of view and then also the creator's point of view. You know, what can you infer from what you know, and then try to put yourself in the shoes of who made this thing and try to find out what you can infer for their ideas about purpose and meaning and communication. And so you want to write about your intellectual as well as your emotional reactions in this section. And here you could consider the principles of the arts, right? So principles are things like harmony, contrast, and balance in terms of the visual, themes, motifs, and symbols in terms of literary, and rhythm, duration, and movement in terms of performing. Now, certainly there is some overlap here, right? Sometimes there are symbols embedded in the visual or performing. Sometimes there's movement, rhythm that can be captured in the way something's written or the way something's created. So certainly you can use from the other kind of disciplines as well to help understand something. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get to the meaning and the purpose of the work. Everything has a meaning and purpose, right? Even the most simple arrowhead or vase has a meaning and purpose behind it. The style, the craftsmanship, the choices that were made also help determine how the thing is used, how it was used between its members of the community. How do they teach members of the community to use it? And then when you go into deeper things, like say, like a painting or a narrative piece, or if you go into a performance or a ritual, there's layers upon layers of meaning there that we're trying to unpack. Some of that you can infer through study. So by reading about the artists who create these things or the cultures that these things were made in. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith on your own and try to use your own intuition, your own understanding, and your own personal experiences to see what you think it might mean and where it might come from. Okay, you should be using both a scholarly perspective that you get out of your textbook or out of the resources I provide, as well as your own personal experience and what it means for you. Now, I'll caution you to not miss one of those two. Oftentimes, students only do the scholarly piece because it's easy to look up the answers, or they'll skip that piece and try to just deduce it on their own. And I caution you, make sure you do both components of interpretation. Otherwise, you're going to miss pieces and ultimately miss points as well. Okay, so that's how we formally critique an artwork or an artifact. I include in Canvas an empty one of these. Now you have to download this whole workbook and print it out. And then you can just handwrite your notes onto the worksheet right here. And then later you'll take a picture of what you've handwritten and then upload that into Canvas. Or if you want to recreate something like this formal criticism worksheet, you can do so in Word or Google or PowerPoint. I don't create those, but you're free to do so. Please note that because what we do in this class is always has a visual component because of the humanities nature, you do need to have a graphic organizer like this worksheet where the information is organized in a visual way. And this is going to serve as your outline for your written component, which I'll explain in a bit. Okay, now this is where it gets a little complicated because you basically do that entire process of analysis and interpretation twice because you do it for both of the artifacts that you have chosen. And then you compare and contrast those two works. And the idea here is to try to tease out information that you couldn't find just by looking at a single work. Okay, so for instance, if you were looking at a specific culture, having multiple works tell you things about that culture. Or if you're looking at a specific movement or period of history or artist, you'll find out some themes and some kind of patterns that create between the different works and the different motives for making those works. So you go ahead and complete that graphic organizer for artifact 1, and then you do it again for artifact 2, and then you use those to answer the questions in this graphic organizer, which is the compare and contrast one. Okay, so when we compare and contrast, contrasting means we find the differences between the works, and comparing is where we find the similarities. Again, I will caution you. Oftentimes, students will just turn in the two descriptors of the artifacts and be like, well, I'm done. No, you need to take another step forward. If you don't use sentences like, in comparison, however, and yet, on the contrary, whereas, these sentences that force you to bridge two ideas, then you're not contrasting. In fact, you're asking the reader to contrast, but that's me, and I want you to do the contrasting, okay? So simply just describing the two artworks is not enough. You have to actually contrast them, right? So there should be sentences like this. This is in contrast to, nevertheless, on the other hand, conversely, despite this, right? Those tell me, those are triggers that say we're looking at two things and we're going to point out a difference between them. Okay, once you've done the contrasting part, you also have to do the comparing part, which is to find the similarities, right? There are things that can be communicated between both works. And there you want to use phrases like likewise, in comparison, for example, for instance, specifically, right? You're going to specifically show me how these two things are used similarly, or are they used in the same way, or they were created by the same artist for the same reason, okay? And then again, I've provided kind of an empty graphic organizer for you to use. And this you would also upload. This is also going to be uploaded into Canvas. So you're going to fill this in. And again, you might handwrite this, print mine out. That's great. You might recreate this in PowerPoint or in Google Slides or Word. All that's great too. I'm not a stickler on how you make these. I'm just a stickler that you do have to use a graphic organizer to organize your thoughts. And this is pre-writing, which means you're doing this step before you're actually writing. It is kind of time intensive, but that's by design. I want you to really do a lot of good brainstorming and a lot of good analysis before you sit down to write. You will submit these along with your written piece as a check that you are using the graphic organizers to outline your thoughts. Okay. Once you've got the graphic organizers filled in, and this one right here in front of us right now is called a Venn diagram. That's used for the compare and contrast. The other one's called a T-matrix, or kind of just a listing, but it separates forms from one another. You're going to use those as your basis for your writing. And then you're going to go ahead and write your journal. Now, it is a written assignment, which means you don't just submit your graphic organizers and call it a day. You still have to write something, okay? You want to follow those guidelines that are posted under the assignment details in Canvas. I highly recommend writing it in a Word document or a Google document first and keeping a draft of it. If you, for whatever reason, run into technical difficulties, then you can always submit again if you have this draft. But if you try to type straight into Canvas and then you lose it, there's no way for me to recover it, and there's usually no way for you to recover it either. Okay, so you're going to type in a Word document or in a Google document, okay? When you are writing, another mistake often I see is when a student writes, they think, okay, just sit down and write and then hit submit. That is only a draft. That is not a final written assignment. In order to have a final written assignment, you have to do a few things. First, you have to make sure that you capture everything in your graphic organizers. Second, when you write, you want to make sure that you're writing for your audience. In this case, your audience is me, your instructor, which means I'm looking at this as college level writing. It should be free of grammar errors, free of spelling errors. It should have collegiate level writing skills. It should be structured correctly. It should have organization to it, and it should have flow. The best way to check your flow and your structure and your organization and the development of your thesis statement is to read your paper out loud and edit it after you've read it. A final draft has to have gone through the editing process. You have to have gone back and reread your writing. No one hits it all out on the first try. We all have to go back and double check for grammar, for spelling, for flow, for structure, and accuracy. Some tips on writing can be found at this really great resource, which is Purdue OWL. It's got a very easy URL to type in. If you just search Purdue OWL in any search engine, it'll come up right away. Plenty of great resources there. It's got some information on how to write a thesis statement, on how to structure the paragraphs in your written work, how to make sure it sounds collegiate, how you're citing things, right? You want to make sure that you're adhering to the academic honesty policy, meaning that nothing is plagiarized. A word of advice, I would not use any quotes in your journal. I don't count quotes towards word counts. There's no point in having them. And they often flag the plagiarizer checker. And if you make a mistake, it could come up plagiarized. So I highly recommend paraphrasing, summarizing. And Purdue OWL shows you how not only to do that, but also how to cite that, because you do have to cite the resources that you pull from, including our textbook and any of the resources I provide. Another great resource that you have at your disposal is Waubonsi's Tutoring Center. That link is a little bit more long and a little more complicated, but if you just search Tutoring Center in the Waubonsi webpage, or I always have it linked in Canvas, you'll find it, and then you can go there. They have drop-in Zooms. They have on-site tutoring. They have online tutoring. There's lots of resources that Waubonsi provides, and they will look over your journal before you submit it, and they can help you make sure that it's polished and ready for submission, okay? I highly recommend you avail yourself of these two resources. I can usually tell when students have it, and although I don't necessarily teach the conventions of writing, I do expect you to use collegiate level writing for this course. And so those two resources will help you get there in case you run into some difficulties. They're also there to help you get started. Sometimes students, it's just kind of like writer's block and getting things going. I highly recommend utilizing those two resources to get things moving, okay? Once you've typed everything out in your Word document, okay, this is where you're going to need to follow the directions very clearly in order to submit. Okay, so these are screenshots from our LMS, and you want to make sure that you are doing these exactly the way I say you do them in order to earn credit, okay? So first and foremost, you may not upload a PDF, a Word document, or a Google Doc to Canvas. The plagiarism checker does not work 100% on those. There are errors often with it, and I want to avoid those for you and for me. So you must copy and paste, as it says right here, your submission into Canvas. Because of that, I recognize that you will lose formatting. And that's why I'm not a stickler on formatting in any way, right? It's good to try to follow MLA, APA, or Chicago if you can. But as long as you are citing things in the body and externally, you should be good. Okay, so I'm not a stickler on formatting at all. But you do have to submit it in the submission box itself. So you must copy and paste. Now here's where things get tricky. You must copy and paste the text, but you cannot copy and paste images. And you have to submit images of the artwork or artifacts, and you have to submit images of your graphic organizer. Okay, so you have to submit both those things, an image of your graphic organizer and an image of your artwork. Now, you can do this by just taking a picture from your phone. You can do a screenshot from your computer. That part's totally up to you. I recommend a JPEG or a PNG format. Those are the ones that Canvas likes best. But as long as you save it as an image and you go through the next steps, we should have no problem. All right, now here's the next thing. You'll see over here, I've got a screenshot, and there's a little icon right here of it looks sort of like a mountain landscape with a little sun above it. You're going to click that to upload your images. And that's going to be the images of your graphic organizers and the images of your artifacts. All right. Then down where it says your choices, you're going to choose embed image. You must choose embed for me to grade it. I won't grade if you display it as a link. Okay. If it shows up as a link, I will not grade it. That's largely because two things. When it shows up like as a link, I have to leave Canvas to go view it, which then can cause trouble for me. Sometimes it crashes, sometimes it won't work. Sometimes the image itself is corrupted. Sometimes the image is downloaded then and it comes in with maybe like a virus or something. So I will not click on those links. For whatever reason that they come up, I refuse to click on them. So you'll need to embed the image. It's one more step. It takes just a few more seconds on your end, but it is vitally important for us to have those images as visual communicators and humanities students. And it's also important to be able to view them and grade them accurately. Okay, so you'll click this button right here, which then takes you to upload image, but you must click embed, not attach, not link. Then you have to go find your image and you have to have saved it. That's why you cannot copy and paste it. You must save your image to either your desktop or to your laptop, your Chromebook, to your picture files, whatever, your photo files, whatever it is. You must save it there and then upload and embed there. Again, it takes a few extra steps for you, just a few extra minutes on your part, but it saves a lot of headaches for the entire course. Okay. So you've typed, you copied and pasted your text. You've uploaded all of your images. That's images of your artifacts and images of your graphic organizer. And then the last thing you want to do before you submit is you want to check your word count. You want to make sure you follow the word count as it is presented to you. If you skip that step, you will find that you will lose points. And about is making sure you achieve the minimum word count. To achieve this, a letter grade of a C. It's a passing grade for a humanities course. You must meet the minimum word count. And that's because there is an expectation of the amount of quality content that you submit in order to answer and address the questions of interpretation, analysis, compare, and contrast. You must hit that, because if you're not hitting that, you're not diving deep enough. And sometimes students will say, well, Aaron, I'm very brief. I know how to summarize. Well, that's great. And I appreciate brevity. I'm assuming that already. I'm assuming some brevity. That means you must go into a great level of detail in order to write this written assignment. Without doing so, your grade will definitely suffer. All right. So now you've copied and pasted your text. You've uploaded your images. You've uploaded your graphic organizer. You've made sure that everything's embedded and nothing is appearing as a link. If it is appearing as a link, you have to go back and redo it. Okay? Have all that done. Check your word count, and then you can hit this button, Submit Assignment, and then you'll see it goes in. All right. That is how you create an analysis journal for the humanities courses. If you've got questions, comments, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to walk you through those steps one more time. This is captured in videos. You can see it, but it's also captured in text-based in Canvas. So please, 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 if you've got questions, do reach out. And good luck on writing your journal. I look forward to reading them. Thank you.